Tonight we are doing the first in our the book lecture series. The book The Past is going to be presented by Dr. Nick Wilding, professor at Georgia State University. But before we jump into that, I just would like to point out that this series of lectures has been made possible by Georgia Humanities, and we have two more lectures after this one. One in October 12th. Dr. Jesse Erickson at the University of Delaware will present the book The Present. And in November 9th, Dr. Sarah Werner, who's an independent historian, will present the book The Future. This programming is being held in conjunction with a wildlife Guild of Bookworkers exhibition, which features 50 plus artists or members of the Guild of Bookworkers, the traveling exhibition. And that's on display now at the Robert C. Williams Museum of Papermaking. As I mentioned, we're the Robert C. Williams Museum of Papermaking. I'm Jerusha Graham, the museum coordinator. And I'd just like to take a few minutes to tell you about the museum. We're located in Atlanta, Georgia, on the Georgia Institute of Technology campus within the Renewable Bioproducts Institute. Our mission is to collect, preserve, increase, and disseminate knowledge about papermaking, past, present, and future. And we have 4 permanent exhibit spaces, 2 changing exhibit spaces, a classroom, and we do programming for ages 5 through adults. We have approximately 100,000 artifacts and 7,000 books in our collection, all focused on papermaking and paper-related topics. And now to the series. So the book, The Past, is being presented by Dr. Nick Wilding. Dr. Nick Wilding is professor of history at Georgia State University, where he teaches early modern history, the history of science, and the history of the book. He is the author of Galileo's idol, Gianfrancesco Segreto, in the Politics of Knowledge, from the Chicago University Press, 2014, Faussaire de Lune, from the National Library of France, 2015, and a dozen research articles. He has held fellowships at Stanford, Cambridge, Columbia, the American Academy in Rome, the New York Academy of Medicine, the Coleman Center at the New York Public Library, and the Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship of Scholars in Critical Bibliography, Rare Book School. He currently serves on the Council of the Bibliographical Society of America and is a faculty member at Rare Book School. He received his BA in English from Oxford University, his MA in Renaissance Studies from the University of Warwick, and his PhD in history from the European University Institute in Italy. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Nick Wilding.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Paper Museum and Virginia Howell, who can't be here tonight, for the invite, and to the Georgia Humanities Council for funding this lecture series. I'm going to go over and share my screen now, I hope. Okay, good. Thank you for... So the aim of this talk is to consider the kind of broad history of the book up to the present moment, but also the way in which the book has been studied and conceptualized. And it's going to be in 2 parts. The first is a kind of the standard narrative, I guess. Okay, so the way that the book history is usually organized is via a series of timelines. And these are usually, depending on the criteria that are used or the combination of criteria, these are usually told as kind of stories of progress and stories of kind of teleology leading up to our present state. So if we look at accounts of the materiality of books. And here we're going to take a fairly large, although I'm going to be arguing not large enough view of what a book is. If we look at the materials used, you'll see a kind of almost like an Enlightenment account of it. Starts with stone and then goes to bone, and then you get marks in clay, and then papyrus comes along, and meanwhile somewhere else in the world you'll have shells being used, and bamboo and skins, wood, leaves, bark, silk, wax, and then the stuff that leads up to the materials with which we're most familiar, parchment, paper, and of course the current regime of LED and other forms of e-screens. This story gets told in different ways, so you can tell it in terms of format rather than material. So in some ways this is from the tablet with a long excursion through different formats, wooden boards, rolls and scrolls, strip books, assembled in various ways, concertina style, or various different butterfly books. And then we arrive at the codex, what we think of as the book. And then a kind of return to the tablet or the scroll with our phones and e-readers. Similarly, stories of technological progress start with incision, so making marks in something, and then inscribing, making marks on something, laying a different material onto it. Then the emergence of woodblock printing. Remember, this happens first of all in China and Korea, and then the development of movable type also in Korea and China before it emerges in Europe. And then separately, the European hand press and the related reinvention of movable type, and then different technologies such as intaglio printing, and then that's quite a stable regime, at least in the Western world. And then we have a series of innovations from the late 18th century onwards: stereotype, lithography, and then things like typewriters, rotary press, linotype, photocopying, word processing, and the modern e-book. Another way of organizing this narrative is to think of this societally, and there's usually a story of progress from oral societies who are considered to lack writing, emerging or evolving into literate societies with various forms of writing, and then the big breakthrough, the typographical man, and our current head-scratching world of what it means to be digital. There's nothing chronologically wrong with any of these accounts, apart from the fact that they look like stories of progress. And we should always remember that any of these chronologies are not stories of technologies becoming obsolete, but rather being supplemented and by new technologies and creating new kind of ecosystems where technologies or materials or formats live alongside each other rather than replacing each other. So these should be seen as kind of cumulative stories, and sometimes not stories that move linearly along a line towards modernity. So you'll see technologies being rejected, technologies being ignored, technologies being jumped over, technologies being revived at times. So the story isn't a linear one, however we choose to frame it. Could we move to the next slide, please? So some of the tools that have been used for this, we don't need to click on these. I can put these links in the chat. You may well be familiar with them. These are just a couple of the very many tools that have been that have been produced over the last century or so to study particular facets of book production. The tools that have emerged have been invested in peculiar moments in book history and made that history look as though some epochs are more important than others. So the incunabula period, especially from the 1450s up to 1501, has been extremely heavily studied. And if you look at the ISTC, the Incunabula Short Title Catalogue, you'll see that there are currently about 30,000 different editions there. This is all Western European printing. There's nothing from China or Korea in there. And it's incredibly useful and thorough, but also cuts off in 1501. And then there's a bit of a lacuna until things start up again with things like the Universal Short Title Catalogue, and then projects like Early English Books Online, which allow for digitized versions of lots of the full contents of these books. There are also kind of meta tools, so things like the Atlas of Early Printing, I'll put that link in later, where the ISTC data has been pulled out and you can nicely animate through, say, the spread of printing and put in different factors like universities or trade routes or political units, and see if you can work out why print in Europe spreads like it does. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the way that the discipline has emerged, various dates are given for the birth of the history of the book, all of which I think are pretty arbitrary. This is a fairly usual kind of bibliography of the history of the book, some kind of key points. And I don't think that this is at all accurate, but I think it's a kind of useful map of how people conceive of the field generally. So we start in the early 20th century with an introduction to bibliography for literary students. The aim here is, or the reason to study books, is to understand the physical processes of their manufacture in order to remove the mess created by compositors and printers and get back to something more that's more authentic, closer to the utterance of the author. And the key figure here is William Shakespeare. Shakespeare studies dominates the raison d'etre for this kind of approach. So it's all about editing Shakespeare out of the mess of print into something like his manuscripts might have looked like, even though we don't have any. So an idea of authorial intention dominating the field there. The standardized vocabulary, again with the handprint book as its object of study, was and continues to be Fredson Bauer's Principles of Bibliographical Description, a book that trains you to speak bibliography. So you can physically describe a book and compare copies without laying your hands on them once you learn to speak Bauer's. Both of these projects emerge from an Anglo, to some extent Anglo-American approach, which is deeply empirical. It's about analytical bibliography, about amassing the data. So in some ways, what we see with something like the ISTC, the Incunable Short Title Catalogue, is the raw data that informs these kinds of approaches. In the 1950s, Lucien Febvre and Henri-Jean Martin took a different approach and brought the methodology and the questions of the annals school, social history, to the question of European print. And with L'apparition du livre, translated not for 2 decades, translated as the coming of the book, they sought to, in some ways, create a kind of material approach to intellectual history. This is something that Febvre especially had been working on with his studies of, say, irreligion in the world of Rabelais. These questions of how we understand the ordinary or the limits of the ordinary universes of people's lived experiences across the space of centuries. And so they brought a statistical analysis and a deep kind of study of the commodification of the book, trying to write a social history of the based around the Gutenberg's invention of or reinvention of movable type and his deployment of presses in the 1450s onwards. That same epoch becomes the starting point for possibly the most famous book in the American tradition of book history, Elizabeth Eisenstein's 2-volume Printing Press as an Agent of Change. Eisenstein, as you probably know, makes a series of quite bold causal arguments about the impact of print not just being quantitative, as Febvre and Martin had tended to argue, but being qualitative as well. So drawing on the work of cultural theorists such as Marshall McLuhan, and making an argument that print changed the way people thought, because it fixes things through type and allows for the standardization of knowledge, and perhaps even a modern epistemology emerges from typography. That's an argument that's been repeatedly challenged, most cogently, I think, by Adrian Johns in his work, The Nature of the Book. Excuse me. A good overview of the state of the discipline, which is in some ways a kind of celebration, but also there's a hint of despair in it, is Robert Darnton's essay, What is the History of Books?, where he describes the 1982 state of book history as interdisciplinarity run riot. He thinks that there's too much going on, and that there's no disciplined methodology at work, and that we're in danger of missing out on having a kind of agreed upon subject or question. And it's implicit that this is a bad thing. If we can move on to the next slide, please. One of the kind of usually tacit definitions of the book, but sometimes it becomes quite explicit to differentiate it from other kinds of objects, are a series of qualities that are supposed to technologically or media, in terms of media, inhere in the object. So books are usually described as portable objects to differentiate them from, say, inscriptions on buildings. They're meant to be legible. And in the case of the print revolution, especially in the arguments of people like Eisenstein, they're supposed to be identical, more or less, to other copies. Here in front of us, we see the Harry Ransom Center Gutenberg Bible, and you'll see that it's in a glass case, very unportable. You'd get arrested if you tried to take that away. Not really very legible to most of us. And as we'll see in the next slide, far from identical to other copies. So could we move on to the next slide, please? Here I've just taken a 4 copies, more or less at random, of the Start of Genesis from the Gutenberg Bible, and I just wanted to put these up so that you'll see that at least in the early decades of print, none of the qualities that we might think of as tied into typographical culture or print culture, this term that gets thrown around a lot, sometimes without much thought, are actually present or unproblematically present in an object like the Gutenberg Bible. So you'll see that there are different materials being used. Top left, I think, is now I didn't label them, which is which. I think that's one of the British Library's 2 copies on vellum. Some of the edition was printed on vellum, a total edition of probably 150 to 180 copies. Most of them were printed on paper. So you have a differentiation of audience and cost there. You actually have, if you probably can't see it on this size, but there's actually slightly different text. The text at the start of the book gets reset as Gutenberg increases the print run and goes and resets the early parts of the book. So the black ink, which is all that's being printed here, actually has different text or different settings. You'll see that there are little red blobs on some of the copies at the starts of sentences. So somebody who's not a printer comes along and rubricates. You'll see that the illumination is done in different styles. And people like Eric White and Paul Needham have carefully gone through all of these copies and told the stories of each of these individual copies. The binding is different. Remember, binding doesn't happen at the point of production, but rather at the point of consumption, usually at this point. And we'll also see marks of use. So you can see some corrections, you can see wear and tear. The books might be different dimensions as they're trimmed down. So one thing that you can pretty much guarantee from an intunable copy is that it's actually going to be different to every other copy within the same edition. So whereas we might think of a 20th century book, my copy is the same as your copy, that's generally not going to be the case for early hand press books. They get assembled wrongly, there are stop press corrections, all kinds of things happen to them in their production. Next slide, please. It's also important to remember that even though we think that book history should be about books and that the archetypal book is the Bible in the Western European tradition, that's not what printers are actually making most of the time. They're always, the investment in producing a big book like that ties up so much capital that in order to produce those kinds of works, almost all printers are producing ephemeral works, sometimes in massive numbers. So on the left here, you see a Gutenberg printed indulgence. And even though very few of these survive, mostly as binders waste, we have accounts, orders of thousands and thousands, sometimes orders of tens of thousands of these being made. So if you compare just the mass of this kind of job printing up against the book production, this is what printers are generally doing. Another important point, you'll see that there are gaps in that text. Print does not replace manuscript, it merely modifies it. Peter Stalabras has argued that actually print creates manuscript culture, and manuscripts fulfill these kinds of prints. Top right there, you see this is what Ben Franklin did for most of his printing life. He made little receipts and forms and bills and things like that. That's what most printing actually is. It's not the codex form at all. It's fragments of ephemera. And this continues to the present day, where we have this ongoing relationship between the manuscript and the pre-printed, so my driver's license, which becomes an authentic document only with my image and my signature transferred to it, and something that we do every day. We fill in the blank forms with our manuscript via a keyboard in a Google search. So this, it's completely the wrong idea to think that print comes along and kills manuscript. It merely modifies the form and use of manuscript and channels it in different directions. Can we move to the next slide, please? So I don't know if this is legible at all. Going back to Darnton's 1982 article, he wanted to provide what he thought would be a useful model for book historians to think about the what he calls the communication circuit. So thank you. So the top part there is Darnton's model, thinking about how a book kind of progresses from author to publisher, just trying to get all of the individuals and power relationships and different skill sets and problems and interests and things that can go wrong and things that can go right that make books and the materials required. These are all of the factors that we have to think about when we're doing book history. We're not at all thinking about Greg's question, which is, what is the best possible text, the most Shakespearean text that we can come up with? We're thinking of the book as a material object being produced not just by an author. Remember, an author doesn't make a book, so lots of other people actually turn a text into a book, and that this is a cyclical movement where it doesn't stop with the book being produced. The book then comes back to the author, maybe with a revised second edition or a new topic for the next work coming out of that circuit. We scrolled down within that same slide. That model was challenged by Nicholas Barker and Thomas Adams, because it doesn't really have the book as its object. It's all about the people, so this is a kind of reconfiguration with the social pressures being put on the outside, and the book's process of production being put in the inside with these kind of pressures being applied externally. And then, importantly, the insertion of this extra factor that Darnton hadn't really considered, the survival of books. In Darnton's world, it's as though the only books that exist are ones that have just come off the press. Whereas actually, as we all know from our own experience, we have piles of old books and the second-hand markets and lending libraries and all of these places of accumulation and interaction of different generations of books. So they tried to adapt Darnton's model into something that was more book-centered and less people-centered. It should be apparent that both of these models speak mainly to the kinds of books that these individuals were most interested in, even though they're proposed as kind of generalizable models. So Darnton worked mainly on books around the French Revolution. Barker works mainly on earlier books, but both of them working on the hand press European tradition, the pre-industrialization and post-manuscript, even though, as I've already said, there is no such thing as post-manuscript. So these become kind kind of normative disciplining models that get adopted within the emerging discipline of book history. And to my mind, useful as they are within certain contexts, they start to kind of close down other ways of thinking about the book. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So in 1986, Donald McKenzie, the New Zealand-born bibliographer who spent a large chunk of his career in Oxford, delivered the British Library, or was it British Museum at that point, Panizzi lectures. Some of the most interesting lectures ever given on the history of the book, where he tried to expand the purview of bibliography and book history. And he did this not just because he thought that there was more to life than books printed between 1500 and 1800. He himself specialized in authors like Congreve, but because he realized that we were silencing large parts of potential book history by over concentrating on the Western Codex and normalizing that as the condition of, or the precondition of, book history. So a couple of quotes from his essay, Bibliography and Sociology of Text. Bibliography is the discipline that studies text as recorded forms and the processes of their transmission, including their production and reception. That might not seem very radical, but he then goes on to say, I define text to include verbal, visual, oral, and numeric data in the form of maps, prints, and music, of archives of recorded sound, of films, videos, and any computer-stored information. Everything, in fact, from epigraphy to the latest form of discography, writing in 1986. He went on to write this beautiful piece about the Treaty of Waitangi, where New Zealand Maori leaders signed over land rights to Queen Victoria. And he argued that if you look at literacy rates, and if you think about literacy in a non-Western way, you realize that that this treaty is actually a deeply imbalanced power play. It's not a consensual document in the way that it was presented within the Anglophone tradition. So bibliography has real-life political applications and can be used to rethink the history of pretty much everything, but including things like the history of political science. If we go to the next slide, please. One of the implications of this, and an idea that's been kind of expanded or explored by subsequent historians, is that this redefinition of the text beyond the alphabetic representation of speech, as it is usually conceptualized within the Western post-Enlightenment tradition. If we think of it just as the text as any record, then we're forced to expand our definition of what might be admissible to the study of book history, what we could think of as bookish things. Jermaine Warkentin, in a great article, In Search of the Word of the Other, Aboriginal Sign Systems and the History of the Book in Canada, argued that the wampum belts, lower right image there, were textual narratives and not as Europeans understood them, mere currency. In fact, she shows very clearly that Europeans knew fully that these were not currency, but they chose to view them as currency when they didn't want to hear the stories that they were telling. But these are also text. At the top we have a quipu, the knotted string narratives, whose meaning is still being deciphered. And if we think about recording in a larger sense, an inscription in a larger sense, we can also start to think of practices such as tattooing as being part and parcel of the of bibliography. If we think about what constitutes reading, or what is legible, it's not just our system of alphabetic signs. Even within the English language, we use read as though it's only to do with alphabetic signs, but in most other languages from which within which the word read comes, and even in English itself, it's a much broader field of practice. So we can read things like dreams or riddles or omens fairly unproblematically. We don't think of that as a metaphorical reading. We can read music, we can read maps, we might read the sky or tea leaves or people's minds. People can or have at some points in time believed that they read the entrails of animals for signs. We can read hands, we read faces, we read lips. We can read scientific instruments. Sometimes, not in the Zoom era anymore, but we can read a room. And reading even gets applied to the non-human in a non-metaphorical way in lots of fields. So computers read from the 1940s onwards, and genes even are reading from the 60s onwards. We could think of various machine reading histories going back to the pre-electronic age, pianolas, or the coding for looms in the 18th century, or automata having texts inscribed on the drums, or back into late medieval Europe with pre-programmed bells. So reading shouldn't be considered necessarily as having anything to do with speech or with alphabetic representation. We might even, if we're feeling especially daring, say that not only do texts not require humans to read them, animals might be able to read. Are bees reading when they watch each other dance? That's a recorded text and a form of communication. Are people, when we track footprints, is that that's a form of imprinting? It's ephemeral, but then so are lots of our daily newspapers. Perhaps we don't even need to think about the visual. We could think of scenting something as a form of reading. If we go on to the next text, please. I realize that there's a danger here that we might think of that by expanding the notion of the book and the past of the book, and responding to McKenzie's call to think more adventurously about the field of bibliography as being able to speak to any form of recording, we might think that this is just another form of kind of colonialization. The book, the codex, has obviously been used very concretely as a tool of imperial control on a global scale. If we were to take that map of the within the atlas of early printing and project it on another 100 years, you would see especially Jesuit presses being set up around the world. And if we take it another couple of 100 years, you'd see Western-style presses being used as systems of governmental control globally. And there's a danger, I think, that if we expand the term of the book, that we're trying to kind of absorb and assimilate lots of different textual traditions and saying that they're all really like our books. I don't think that that's necessarily the case. And I think that what this move allows us to do is actually think of the diversity of bookishness within, say, the Western tradition as well. There's a scene in Purgatory, in Dante's account, where an angel takes out his sword and cuts 7 P's, the 7 peccati, the sins, into Dante's forehead, and one by one, as he moves through Purgatory, these P's disappear. He's branded or incised or tattooed. It's unclear. These letters are cut into him. He becomes a text. His body is marked in much the same way that, say, Captain Cook encountering Polynesian or natives encounters these forms and isn't quite sure what to make of them. But when he speaks to the natives, they describe writing as a form of tattooing. Another way in which this expansion of the bibliographical allows us to rethink Western history is by taking more seriously what's usually written off as just a kind of metaphoric version of the idea of the book. So this is kind of by way of ending, though not by way of conclusion. A famous quote from Galileo's Saggiatore that I don't have a translation here, so I'll do it on the wing. Galileo says, in responding to his Jesuit adversary, a guy who's taken the pseudonym, invented himself as a text under the name of Sarsi, who Galileo accuses of being slavishly the slavish disciple of Aristotle. Galileo says, that's not how we go about doing science. So he says, here's the quote: "Philosophy is written in this huge book, which is always open in front of our eyes. I speak the universe." Weird phrase. But one cannot understand it unless first one understands, you learn to understand the language and know the characters in which it's written. It's written in mathematical language, or mathematical tongue, rather, and the characters are triangles, circles, and other geometric figures. Without these means, it is impossible humanly to understand a word, and without these, one is wandering vainly in a dark labyrinth. So I'd like to suggest that for Galileo, if we're thinking about what kind of thing can be a book, this isn't just a figure of speech. This isn't just him deploying his marvelous rhetoric, although it's also that. This is him using a cultural resource. It's a long-standing trope, the book of nature. He's setting it up against Aristotelian book learning, but it's also meant to be a supplement to the other book, the book of the scripture, Gutenberg's Bible, the more traditional text. But here he's saying that the universe itself is a sign system, which can be, he's kind of looking into the matrix here and seeing the dynamic world of mathematical diagrams. And in reprinting those diagrams, as he's done in his book, although you'll see there are certain things that can go wrong in a book, like the diagram that's inverted on page 120 there, in every single copy of this book. In reprinting that, the philosopher is actually retracing the mind of God. So bibliography can allow us, I think, to rewrite not only global history and the history of cultural interactions over long periods of time, but also any branch of intellectual or cultural history. Even the kinds of stories that we thought we already knew can be rewritten by expanding the notion of what book history has been, can be, and will be. And that's where I'll end, and hopefully we'll be able to have a conversation.
So I'm just taking a quick look at the chat. Romaine says, Nick, what do you make of redefining the book to encompass other forms, whether textual or pictorial or live performance, etc., like archives, paintings, plays by some book artists?
A good question. I'm in a kind of free fall at the moment where I'm not sure quite what the limits are. In some ways, this is a bit like asking somebody to define art. And I thought for a while, well, maybe Duchamp and Warhol were right, and it's whatever sells. But maybe I'm not sure. Textual or pictorial or live performance. I mean, if we take McKenzie's comments seriously, any form of recorded text, he doesn't distinguish between words and images at all. And in fact, he jumps straight in and says, maps are books. He doesn't get into the world of, is a Dürer woodcut a book, but I don't see any reason why he wouldn't. He says that basically any semiotic system that is recorded, though he doesn't seem to have much desire for there to be permanence in the recording, can be a book form. So he even says, as long as the sign system is invested semiotically, that sounds tautological, then it's a book. So he says, an Australian landscape that narrates the history of the people living there. The landscape itself is to be viewed bibliographically and understood as a book. We don't need portability. We don't need replicability. We don't need scripturality. It can be the thing itself. I suspect at some level, though, he'd also say sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and that not everything is amenable to, that there has to be some kind of semiotic burden and possibly communication possible between people. I'm not sure if that's the key factor, that there's a communicative recording device. I'm not sure if that's an answer. I mean, I think that blank books are clearly also books, so I'm not sure what they're communicating. A printer's dummy is clearly a book. And books which are never meant to be seen by other people are clearly books. So I'm not sure that even the communicative function is necessary in this kind of definition. I don't know if that's an answer. There's another question from Penelope Hall. Maybe I missed this, but where or when did humor become incorporated in books? I mean, whatever you find funny. Become incorporated in books, intentional gags or just things that, I'm one of those people who finds the Bible quite funny, but I know it's not probably meant to be. That's just me. When did joke books emerge? Well, I mean, you could go back to, there are obviously jokes in the Bible. Adam's name is meant to be funny, right? He's the mud man. So there are puns in the Bible, which I assume are meant to be humorous. Genres of humor books, Roman satire, and then joke books as a discrete genre come about in the Renaissance. They're not funny though. Those books that say that they're joke books it's just impossible to find any humor in those. I find. Do we have Further questions?
So I'm curious, how does the conversation around bibliography and definition of what is a text, are those conversations different in non-Western, like among non-Western scholars, or just maybe coming at it from a different perspective?
Well, sorry, I missed that. There was actually a section I meant to cover there. I meant to say, within even that, the kind of standard narrative that I started with you'll have noticed that there were lots of European white men in that story. Even in the construction of their data, we are increasingly realizing that lots of non-white men were involved in the bibliographical work there. So we think that we tend to tell a kind of historic narrative of these head librarians or bibliographers kind of striding off into the unknown, but they're doing it on the shoulders of huge teams of usually poorly paid women. But there's also a whole school of some great projects at the moment about Black bibliography in the US. If we start to look for non-Western bibliographical traditions as well, and think about what might constitute these kinds of, there's been a certain amount of kind of very straightforward comparative work between, say, the Chinese book and the European book, especially to see people like Peter Burke have tried to see whether there is such a thing as a print revolution conceived of amongst the Chinese literati, because they have print centuries before Gutenberg. So does the same thing happen? And if not, why not? And his answer is, for various reasons, no. This isn't a technologically deterministic series of unfortunate events. This is a social movement where print itself doesn't have the kind of agency that, say, Elizabeth Eisenstein is usually understood as ascribing to it. If we expand the idea of textuality or the book even wider than that and say, we don't need to subscribe to ideas of full literacy as the end point of civilization. I think we kind of operate within this kind of Enlightenment hierarchy of civilizations, where we think the codex, the book, is the best thing that that's ever been made, and that everything else is leading up to it, rather than thinking about what functions different kinds of communicative objects or recorded text or whatever kind of universal descriptor we want to utilize is actually doing within the individual societies. So the traditional account would be to say something like, there is no such thing as the Australian book until the Brits bring it, right? And they come along with a printing press, and then they start printing. Or McKenzie's work in New Zealand. But as soon as you start thinking about, say, the landscape as text, or the tattoo systems as text, or anything that's communicative, not necessarily even visual, then that whole idea of that hierarchy of literacy starts to dissolve and just become a self-serving story that I think we don't need anymore. And actually, we need not to have now. We need to be able to have much more flexible categories of thinking about, of de-hierarchalization. I can't even say it. Getting rid of those cultural hierarchies and just looking at communicative practices and how memory functions, and how storytelling functions, and what kinds of objects have roles within within communication. So I'm not sure if that's an answer to your question, but I think it's an expansion. At the same time, I wouldn't want to argue that I think it would be dangerous to kind of say, oh, everything's a book, and therefore the Western Codex and the Western printing press has not been a vector of power, because it clearly has. The efforts to render literate and force into language, frequently by missionary associations globally, from the Jesuits on, have been intensely culturally destructive. Imperial census taking, the production of the entire apparatus, the state apparatus that relies on paper from Philip II onwards, those global empires, all of them relying on these long distance systems of textual control and inscription devices and disciplined information gatherers. Those are forms of power. So I think it would be dangerous to say everything's a book, and so we don't have to talk about power anymore. I think this is a way of really recognizing how power works and how categories like literacy are loaded with power rather than neutral descriptors as we generally deploy them. There are a couple of more comments in the chat. Opens up what was very seemingly exclusive privilege into something that can be understood without traditional literacy. Yes, and there, if you look at, when I bring, say, my Georgia State students to Emory Rare Book Room, you see sometimes the way that, and that's a welcoming space. I mean, there are far more forbidding spaces. You see the kind of the privilege of some of those places and the exclusivity, not in a good sense, of some of those spaces can be deeply intimidating. So I think the other way of casting a wider net of thinking about bibliography is to decenter the Western Codex as just one form of book. Not the best, just one form, one that's been very powerful, but not, and the hierarchies we have within the ways that we organize the Western Codex. So the Gutenberg Bible within a cage or a glass, the untouchable icon of itself that it's become, or the ways that we go about collecting accounts of Columbus letters. If you think of the most expensive documents in the most collectible objects in book history, it's things like the Bay Psalm book, right? The North American printing. It doesn't matter that there were books being printed in Mexico City a century before that, because what we're trying to, what the collectors want is to reenact early Americana and possess it. And frequently, possess it in a very exclusive way. And I think anything we can do to open up those doors and relativize those hierarchies and rethink value has to be socially beneficial. I'm trying to read while I talk, and I realize I can't. Do you think those different forms of communication were intentionally looked down upon by privileged who could afford books and were what they considered traditionally literate? Yes, I mean, you see this emerging in the late. I know best because this is kind of my own privilege here. This is the field I was educated in, European history. Renaissance writing starts already in the 16th century to construct these kind of hierarchies of alphabets. where there's full alphabetization. Sometimes there are ideas of there being a pristine, early, pure form of writing that's been lost. Maybe Adam knew how to write, and now what we're trying to do is to get back to that kind of writing. A lot of this is about trying to negotiate. How do we negotiate with Mesoamerican writing? The general approach was burn it. When codices, as they become assimilated, get taken to Europe, there's an intense debate about are these just pictures? Could they actually be a writing? If so, why can't we understand it? Because we're Europeans, we understand everything. And so there's this kind of frustration, and you see that kind of turning into hierarchies where you'll have low-level communication being the Mesoamerican, and then the Chinese or the Japanese are more sophisticated. And even though they haven't yet discovered the great tradition of the Greek alphabet leading up to modern vernaculars, the climax of civilization, they're on the way there. So you see these semiotic systems being inserted very consciously into cultural hierarchies and being used to justify those hierarchies as well. So I think there are, to that question from Barbara Swanson about privilege. That's and even our terms literate. We still use this, like literacy rates being 98% or something. What does that even mean? What does it mean? I'm not fully literate. What would full literacy mean? Does it mean being able to sign a name? Does it mean being able to mumble along with something? Does it mean being able to recite entire passages from the Bible? Like what constitutes literacy? Literacy is a range of functions that's socially specific, and yet certain groups define it in certain ways in order to exclude other groups frequently. Priests and ministers, yes. We do. I think this is changing, and I think actually here we are in COVID land. The kind of one of the places that's been most affected in I think a really interesting way. The cultural institutions have generally responded really with a surprising degree of flexibility and opened up because of COVID to the realm of the virtual, where the usual social hierarchies can't really be applied. So I've taken my students on so many kind of rare book tours where we've talked to librarians because their libraries are closed and they want people in there, and it's a lot cheaper. So I think there are the tiny silver lining in COVID, which I think will outlast COVID. That's probably a rash prediction, outlasting COVID. Is that some of that exclusivity in cultural institutions might have permanently disappeared just through the force of virtual access. Things like this can happen without you having to be in the center of an increasingly expensive gentrification center, Atlanta.
I'm curious if there's a project or a contemporary of yours that you're just kind of excited about the work that they're doing in this area?
So many, yes. So I'm in the Bibliographical Society of America, which has traditionally been, I think it's fair enough to say, quite a male, white, rich place. A couple of years ago now, they drew up and have actually implemented the most important part, an equity action plan, which is really changing that. The president, Barbara Shaler, who's trained as a medievalist at Yale, has really kind of led the charge there. We have, so the next two speakers in this series, Jesse Erickson and Sarah Werner, are the new editors of the papers of the Bibliographical Society of America. We have loads of young members joining. It's really, really diversifying and changing, and there's a ton of really interesting work. Asking precisely this set of questions, like beyond Shakespeare, what can we look at? Like there's no reason for 80% of the papers of any journal, apart from possibly Shakespeare studies, to be about Shakespeare, and even those should be about something else as well. So, and I love Shakespeare. Don't get me wrong, but there are other things out there. So how so I think that at the institutional level as well, book historians are coming out of lots of different fields as well. They're kind of trend cultural historians. They're doing anthropological work. They're not coming in with the same kind of set of bibliophiliac kind of fetishism of the book, where it's all about the smell of leather and that kind of quite dodgy discourse of. And don't get me wrong, I like the smell of leather as well, but that's not why I'm interested in books. That's just an extra. Um, yeah, pretty much everywhere I look, it's changing so rapidly, and just the fact that um, a new field. I mean, if you'd said 50 years ago that one of the most rapidly expanding fields was going to be the history of books, you'd think like the intersection of those two terms. No, that's not the future. History of science, sure, like science is important, but books, no, they're clearly going to die. And instead, exactly the opposite has taken place. There's been this kind of meeting between the disciplines. People have seen that there's this kind of free. It's not quite a discipline. It is this kind of interdisciplinary melee where you can just kind of say, yeah, actually, what I'm doing as a historian or as an anthropologist or as a literary person or as a political scientist or as a scientist is that I study inscriptions over time. Like that's basically what most of us are doing, whether we're in front of keyboards inputting stuff or reading. Most of us are at some level engaging in textuality. Um, and we're doing it when we're twittering, and we're doing it when we're reading for pleasure. And I also no, that's unconnected. Well, no, I will say there's a really great book by Leah Price, who's at Rutgers, called "What We Talk About When We Talk About Books," where she's just got really sick of the kind of the death of the paper book discourse, all those New Yorker articles or whatever of people saying, oh, back in my day, we used to read real books. And so she points out, she's a Victorianist, and she points out people have always skimmed. People have always not owned the books. They've borrowed stuff. So all of these kind of anxieties about the textual condition now, the death of the book, completely misplaced. It's just the electronic in itself hasn't really changed that much. People are actually reading more. And if they're reading superficially, they've always read superficially. Socrates was complaining about that. So Socrates didn't like writing. There are. So I think that there is a kind of movement in book studies to kind of be quite conservative culturally, but there's a counter movement which recognizes that that's not very interesting and it doesn't explain very much about the world. And it certainly, what that kind of narrative does is exclude a ton of people and not engage lots of other people. So you better change your story. So I think that's the kind of take home. Change the story. Change the object, make the book bigger.
Wonderful. I think that's might be a perfect place for
That's
us
the
to.
soundbite.
Yeah, yeah. I just want to say thank you for an amazing talk, and I'd like to highlight that this is the first in our series. So we've got two more talks. Um, Dr. Jesse Erickson on October 12th, same time, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and then Dr. Sarah Werner, November 9th.
They're both awesome. They're going to be way better than this. Promise.
And just again to say thank you to the Georgia Humanities who made this lecture series possible. If you enjoyed this, I hope that you'll join us again, and also consider supporting the museum using the link there, mygeorgiatech.gatech.edu /giving/papermaking-museum. And I think that was pasted in the chat as well. And if you're just wanting to see what other things are happening at the museum, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest, and our website, paper.gatech.edu. If you haven't registered for the other two talks, you can register there on the website. Thank you again for attending. Thank you, Nick, for just a great start to this lecture series.
Thank you for helping out with the technology as well. And thanks for everyone for sitting through that. Bye-bye.